I have the information about Denise in Spanish, so I'm translating into Malaysian, then into English. So Denise, here at my right, he's born in Montreal in 1964. He has a degree in the Judy Western School for Active Techniques in the USA, and before he got his degree in communication in the University of Quebec in Montreal. Right? He has written and directed 6 short films. On parlait pas allemand, les 14 définitions de la pluie, Le Feu, et un documentary film, Le Berlin Incendie.
C'est correct.
Yeah. Well, in parallel with his career as a filmmaker, he also is very implied in promotion and diffusion of cinema québécois. That's right. And he was also the president of, vice president of the Cinémathèque Québécoise. And today he is invited professor at the School of Communication Media at the University of Quebec in Montreal. So it's a nice opportunity to know, every one of us, how things are going in a territory that's very similar to us, because they have language, is French, that has to live with or compete maybe with more powerful language, in this case is English. So please tell us how did you...
Okay, thank you. First of all, it's difficult to talk about Quebec culture without making a bit of history and politics, because they are closely related. As you probably know, Canada was discovered, even though it was inhabited by Aboriginal people for a few thousand years, by the French in 1534. And the French established communities over there in order to do fishing, to do hunting and fur trading. That lasted several years and was very much wasn't the target of the British powers at that time. And that resulted in several aggressions, which resulted in the battles of the Plains of Abrahams in 1759. And after that, what was called New France became a region under British domination. And during that time, the teaching of French and the use of French language was quite limited under many different circumstances. And the cities were inhabited by the English regime and the English immigration, mostly Scottish. And the French population moved to the countryside. And they were very much under the power of the Christian, of the priests at that time. And the priests had a very important role in preserving the French language because they said, they were telling people, don't go to the city, it's dangerous, people speak English over there, and you should, remain in the countryside, cultivate the land, love God, and make as many children as possible. So that's what we call the revenge of the cradle, okay, la revanche des berceaux. And for several generations, our mothers and grandmothers and grand-grandmothers had many kids. And we had probably one of the highest birth rate in the world until the 1960s. Just to give you an example, my mother comes from a family of 16 and my father a family of 13. Okay, and even though my brothers and sister were born in the 60s and that tendency was still going down, I come from a family of 6 kids. And all of this was extremely important in knowing that the art scene in Quebec was extremely a rural scene until the 20th century, because people were living in rural regions, and Montreal was mostly an English city, believe it or not, until the beginning of the 20th century, when people started to migrate from the regions to the main city. And so all the art scene was mostly small theater scene that was shown in the churches, and some paintings. And that was about it. No writing, no nothing, no literature. So it was very scarce presence of the Quebec culture at that time. And that all changed when there was the migration in the cities. And that was extremely hard for the people who were actually were coming to live in the city, because they were coming to live in English territory. And it was hard to find French school and to be able to pronounce and to express yourself in the French language. So what was the result of this was that intellectuals who started to bloom in the 20th century had two options. Either they would move and speak English and produce art in English, or exile themselves into Paris, which a lot of people did. And a lot of people as well, when there was the first crisis in 1929, actually moved to the States or moved to England in order to be able to cope with better economic conditions. And that actually, this is probably where the first real Quebec artists started to express themselves. Not a lot of people know that Max Sennett, who hired Charlie Chaplin, who got the first job for Charlie Chaplin in Hollywood, was actually Michel Sinette, being born in Richmond, Quebec, and he actually had immigrated to Hollywood. And he was working along with Ben Turpin, who was very famous for crossing his eyes, and he was part of the Keystone Cups. His name was Benoît Turpin. He was born in all Quebec. So all those people were actually Quebecers that had no choice but to move and to do their trade in other parts of the world. And that all changed in the 60s when there was what we call the Quiet Revolution. And the Quiet Revolution was that actually so many people had migrated to the main cities, which were Montreal and Quebec City, that we started to have voting power. And it's quite late that women have the right to vote, and that people were really interested in voting anyway in Canada. So there's starting to be political powers that wanted to express the political views of people, because since people were living in Montreal where there were no French signs, there was almost no education in French, and especially no economical perspective. The highest job that you could get if you had education in French was actually to be maybe a lawyer or maybe a medicine man, a doctor. Otherwise, you had no other perspective. So that all came about a huge movement in order to give more power to Quebec City, in order to promote French, and that had extraordinary results. And so the 1960s, many universities were open in French. A lot of people had access to free education, which was not the case, and that created a whole new movement. And this is when literature, filmmaking, a lot of arts expression started during those movements. And this is the moment when there was a very important film, not a film commission, a film institution that was built called the National Film Board of Canada, l'Office national du film du Canada. And in that particular institution, they were making documentaries. And the young French-Canadian, the young Québécois filmmakers doing documentaries inside that institution went in the countryside to film old people telling their old stories, and they started to document what was our patrimony, what was our background, our own culture, which people were not really aware of because there was no real communications. And so at that time, people were like sort of trying to forget what was the past because they were living in Montreal, a thriving city, and they wanted to look towards the future. So those guys started to make documentaries where actually the Quebec language, la langue québécoise, was expressed and was recorded on film. And so it was not anymore a language that was the language of the poor people, the language of the losers, because it was seen as the language of the losers. So it was on the big screen, and those films that were made actually were selected in the Cannes Film Festival. Okay, so there was international recognition to this language of losers. So that changed completely the aspect of the way we regarded our own culture. So there was, we started to do theater in Quebec language and fiction films as well in this language that was not understood when it was shot in Paris. It had to be subtitled when it was shot in French because it was like old French, because it's the French that we speak in Quebec, because the French we speak in Quebec is a French that comes from the 17th century, that was sort of frozen in some sort of éprouvette. I don't know how you say éprouvette in what? Probette? Okay. In some sort of like tube, and it was time sealed. And all this movement, created literature, documentaries, fiction films, and pretty much there was about only one theme that was expressed in all these arts movement, and it was a big cry towards independence for Quebec, and that was a major drive that moved the art scene and the intellectual scene in Quebec, and that resulted in the election in 1976 of the first independentist Parti Québécois government of René Lévesque in 1976. And 4 years later, there was the climax of all of this 20 years thrive, which was the first referendum, which was a big battle, and even though there was a lot of people that were in favor of it, there was a lot of a fear campaign that was orchestrated by the federal government in Ottawa, saying to old people that you will not receive your pension checks if you vote yes at the referendum and stuff like that. So there was a lot of tactics that were used that, of course, is sort of understandable in a way. So the result was 60% against the independence and 40% in favor of it, which is, if you think about it, pretty impressive, because this idea was not even existing before 1960. So to go from 0 to 40% with a brand new idea to create an independent state in North America was quite revolutionary. But anyway, 1980, so that means end of the hope. And that reflected itself immediately in the film that we were producing and the literature we were producing, because this project of creating a new alternative country in North America was not in perspective anymore. So what happened is that a lot of people immigrated again to Paris. It was the second immigration. And we started to do co-production, which was one of the major mistakes, because we said that, well, if we cannot create our own state, no one is now really interested in what we're doing because we're not strong enough to walk by ourselves. So we're going to need to start to work with other people. And the 80s were, of course, the Reagan-Thatcher years, which was a conservative, extremely conservative movement. And there was not a lot of public funding towards the art scene at that moment, and there were major cuts, as there were cuts in the States and in England at the same time. And what that happened is that people started to try to find money elsewhere and start doing co-production. And we would do co-production with France, and so you would have all the actors, Quebec actors, trying to talk with the Paris accent, because it had to be palatable to French audiences. Those were like really the depressive years, like from 1980 to 1995. There was really, we sort of lost our own essence, because everybody says, no more nationalist thing, no more territorial things, no more, let's get rid of this silly accent that we have that is preventing us from being hip in Paris. There was a lot of very, very bad movies and bad literature that were produced in those years. And even nowadays, when I'm asked sometimes to do retrospectives of certain periods of time in the film history in Quebec. And when they tell me, okay, you should do something on the 80s, I say, ooh, 80s, that's going to be a tough one, really. 80s, okay, let's try to make a very short program about this. It would be extremely difficult. But then again, as with every generation, there was the balancier went all the way to this extremely depressive state, and then a new generation arrived, and the balancier went on the other side. So there was what we call the new wave, the new Quebec wave, that arrived in at the beginning of the 90s. And these were young filmmakers, and I am considered to be part of that, who actually decided to say again the name of the cities where we were living in, because there was this thing as to erase all the references to the territory, which was extremely quite hip in the 80s film. So we started to say again the name of the small towns where we were living in, the name of the streets, and we would not call ourselves Mike and Steve, but either Benoit and Sylvain. So we would bring back all these notions, but on a level that would say that we assumed our world status. There was a second referendum in 1995, which we lost by merely 20,000 votes, which was 49% in favor against 50 against. So we really had the impression that now we're on a level where there's as much people who are in favor of independence as there are people against, and more people who are in favor of independence when they're young, they keep on being in favor of independence. And the older people are always in every society the people that are more scared of that idea of independence. And those people are getting older and older. What do you know? And they die. So that means that after a while we really have the impression that this idea is going to become more and more present, and hopefully the next referendum will help us to reach that point. And a lot of people are saying to me, why would you care for such an old idea, the idea of a nation with borders and stuff like that. And we know very well that right now the economy is ruling almost every country, and the cultural aspect of every nation is really losing ground every day. As the more and more numbers and economics are gaining power, the less and less culture is being important. And we noticed that in publicity, there was an important breakthrough in Quebec, because this is going to answer what Mr. Carlos Ares was talking about earlier when he was talking about the Galician language. During the 90s, the McDonald's, McDonald's hamburgers, they make publicity, of course, in every country of the world, and the publicity campaigns they were doing were based in Toronto. So Toronto was doing all the political campaigns for McDonald's across Canada. So it was the same people thinking the campaigns, and they would hire a few French Canadian actors in order to do a version of the campaign that would be aired in English Canada. And some guy decided that in McDonald's in the States decided, well, there's 7 million people speaking French in Quebec, and this is as much as many countries in Europe where we have definite publicity campaigns, and they take care of it. Why don't we hire a publicity company in Montreal in order to do that? And they hired people in Montreal, and the ads were spoken in the Quebec language and with direct references to the Quebec territory. And the sales of this, I dislike completely McDonald's and I dislike their food and everything, but still their sales were upgraded of 20% after doing this move. So a lot of people started to say, ooh, there's something here, we should really be thinking about doing specific things with Quebec in order to give them as much leeway, as much power as possible in order to sell our stuffs. our stuff. So right now this idea is more and more important, and there was something extremely important that happened as well, is that during the 80s, those depressive years, am I being too long here?
It's okay.
It's okay, but I'm almost finished, okay. What happened is that during the 80s, a lot of American movies were coming to Canada, to Quebec, to shoot their own movies, because they knew that in old Montreal they could make Paris, they could make London, they could make, without having to cross the Atlantic in order to make their movies. So there was a lot of economical activity around cinema that was made by the US, and actually they hired a lot of technicians, of course, in order to work on those big US production with a lot of money. And so the technical point of view that we had in the 60s that was coming from documentary, actually this turned out that we started to have extremely skilled technicians, directors of photography, even actors and all of this. So actually that started to translate into the movies we were doing, even though we would not adapt to a Hollywood type of storytelling and Hollywood type of filmmaking, but still we had those really well-trained technicians who could do very beautiful films. And so this, with these new young, this new wave of young filmmakers started to make movies that started to appeal again to the Quebec population. So as of the mid-90s to today, the percentage of tickets that were sold in theaters in Quebec that were sold to Quebec films, the Quebec film tickets that were sold was between 15 and 20%, which is a lot in a country where the more than 90% of the film theaters are owned by American majors. So we were actually being able to produce movies that were being seen and enjoyed by the population of Quebec, and this making a film, making an art scene in general extremely thriving. Okay, the only problem that we have right now is that it's very thriving in Quebec, but it's not thriving in some festivals as well in the world. But even with this, it's hard to break in the French market. Even though we speak the same language, but this difference of pronunciation, they still look at us as if we were some sort of remote countryside province for them, and they have this condescendent. They're still very condescending towards what we're doing. I just before I know I'm trying to be as quick as possible. Just before I say a few things about numbers and the film we're producing. I was in Algeria a few months ago, and we were over there to screen a few Quebec films. So I brought a little 3-minute trailer collection that will give you an idea of the movies we are producing nowadays in the recent years. So if you could please start the DVD player so that you just see those trailers. Of course, they're trailers. That's what they are. You won't get the whole thing of the movies. But if we could watch it, it'll give you a bit of an idea. This is my film. Can we have the sound, please? Sound, please.
Moi j'ai un rêve, quelqu'un qui savait taper mourir.
C'est quoi tu veux? Qu'en fais-tu tes papiers?
Qu'est-ce que tu veux de mon fils, toi? Je décroche, je débarque, papa! Je t'aime.
Ceux qui désobéissent peuvent changer le cours de l'histoire. Je ne suis pas venu au Rwanda pour faire l'histoire.
Daniel dit qu'un diagnostic est provisoire, qu'il n'y a jamais rien de certain avec la zone.
Pour l'instant, ça paraît pas trop.
Elle vous a trouvé comment?
Parce que c'est rare de nos jours qu'une demoiselle de Pompéi.
La résurrection, ça n'a pas de bon sens. Il y aurait trop de monde.
La nature est pleine de miracles, infinis, mes amis.
De la famille ici.
Oui. Enfin non, je suis né ici.
À Saint-Étienne.
Oui,
Passager Louis Legros est prié de sauver l'héritage de son père.
Il y a un docteur qui s'en vient à Sainte-Marie pour un mois. On a un mois pour convaincre le docteur de signer un contrat à long terme. Que la meilleure place au monde pour vivre, c'est Sainte-Marie-la-Moderne. Si le docteur signe, on a le gène.
On va faire un grand ménage.
Il faut qu'aussitôt qu'il arrive dans le village, il y ait un peu de foot.
Je peux vous aider?
Le cricket. Réal m'a dit que je suis un fanatique du cricket. Croyez-moi, il y a un docteur quelque part qui veut venir habiter ici. Je le sens.
So like these are a few of the films that were shown in that festival in Algeria. So I will just be closing now on what I was saying. To come back more on a more political ground, we are facing now new problems and new challenges in Quebec because of the fact that we have now one of the lowest birth rates in the Western world. Okay, so like the problems are starting again. So we have an aging population, and besides that, we started to have a very an attitude towards immigration that is starting to be very appealing, starting to work, and it's one of the powers that we have in Quebec. We control our own immigration. It's one of the things that was given to us over the years from the Ottawa government. So we're being more aggressive in order to recruit people from countries that speak French or that are like most likely to be able to learn French. So we have a lot of immigration coming from Algeria. And that was actually the purpose of the movie that I've made and that you've seen the trailer. And countries from the old Eastern Bloc. So what happened is that we have those people coming in to live in Quebec, and they are, of course, they come to live in Quebec, but they are welcomed by Canada. Okay, so Canada welcomes them and saying that this is a bilingual country where English is spoken in the bigger part of the country, and that this, of course, the subtext of this is that if you learn English, you will have a lot more perspective than if you stick only to French. So the challenge that we have now is actually to integrate, I didn't say assimilate, I said to integrate newcomers coming to live in Quebec into a language of the minority. And that is a huge problem. And I was in Catalonia several months ago, and I was at discussion with people, and I believe that you have the same, you're facing the same perspectives and challenges as well in Catalonia. I don't know about Galicia, I know less about Galicia, but I'm sure someone will tell us about this topic in the coming hours. On the last note, that is maybe more hopeful, there was some crazy guy in the suburb of Montreal who started to do little animation films in his bungalow, in the garage of his bungalow, and it was very cheaply made talking heads made with little Muppets. sort of like, I would say, a spitting image, but like in more contemporary way and less related to politics. And they were using extremely raw Quebec language in it. And it became extremely popular among the younger Quebec crowd. And something extremely incredible happened is that with internet, they started to send the links, and this was only distributed through the internet. It was called les têtes à claque. And they started to send the links to their friends in France, in Paris. You should check this out. And even with the language barrier that no one in France was able to understand, the young French people, the people in France and Belgium and Switzerland, and even the ones in Africa that had access to the internet really liked it. And it became like the second or third most visited site on French on the internet, and making numbers that are incredible. And that started to attract the attention of Canal Plus in Paris, and they said, wow, if this is working so well, there must be a few bucks to make with this. So they contacted the guy who was still doing his little Muppet thing in his garage, and they offered him a really, really lucrative contract. And now it's the people in France are watching it on their cell phones and watching it on Canal Plus on television, not just on the internet, on television. And the people from Canal Plus and the people from I think it's Orange, the cell phone company who are distributing this, they said, one thing is for sure, you should not change the language. Because they had offered, well, if you want to, we could try to make a version that would be more palatable to, French audience, and they said, no way, don't change a thing. The young kids love it that way, because it's rock and roll, it's sort of it pushes the limits of the language, of the French language, through borders that have never been imagined in France. And they really liked it, and it's extremely popular. So it means that even if you speak a very minority language, a language that is spoken by only a few people, if you have a very good idea and that you can get people in order to see it and to like it, this can move mountains sometimes. So that'll be the end of my speech. Thank you.
For the debate, I got two ideas that I will share with you. The first is the co-production was a great mistake, and it was tried. And the second one is that you have an audience, you have a public. You can you saw it through the commercials of McDonald's, so there's an audience for that kind of language in Quebec. You saw it. I think that filmmakers in Quebec succeeded to get the keys to the public there, and well, we have just heard about this animation initiative.
And I would just like to add something. While we are making 15% of the share of tickets sold in the cinema, in English Canada, that means from Ontario to British Columbia, they are making less than 1% with English Canadian movies. So they're really looking at the way we are working on the art scene in order to try to reproduce this in their own part of the land, and it's not working. And a lot of people in English Canada opposed to Quebec independence. Not for economical reasons, but really for cultural reasons, because they think that if Quebec separates, there will be with the end of the French presence in Canada, there will be no more difference between them and the United States. So we're sort of a barrier for them in order to not to assimilate to the United States. So it's extremely important for them. And the other thing is that we have a very special situation, is that, we are 7 million population, and Canada's 30 million, and we're sort of isolated. And of course, people, they watch the television, they will watch Quebec television. While in English Canada, when they will open the television and they have access to those American TV shows, which are so well produced, sometimes extremely funny, I have to admit, out of 6 Feet Under. There's all these shows that are shown, prime time, and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the English Canadian TV production cannot compete with that. So actually, a lot of Canadian actors and English Canadian actors are totally unknown in Toronto or in Canada in general, because there's no such thing as a star system in English Canada. It doesn't exist, because if English Canadian actors wants to work, they have to move to Hollywood. They have to move somewhere else. That's the only way they can survive, because the market is just non-existing in English Canada. Even if they have 23 million of population, it just does not exist, because people are watching US stuff. So that's why they don't want Quebec to go. They really wanted to keep, otherwise, they would lose their essence of being, in a way. Sorry.
Yeah, okay, it's okay. So at the end, if the independence come, the people who will lose the social security check will be the English-speaking people.
Yeah.
They will become American.
Yeah,
So it will be the other way around. So, questions, comments, suggestions?
Of course, all my speech was mostly related to cinema, because that's what I know best. I'm sorry I cannot talk about more about politics or about actually funding, but I thought it's still in film somewhere.
No question. Just a question. I have a question.
Yeah.
But could you comment on the relationship between, if there is any, the Toronto Film Festival and the Festival de Film du Monde?
It's a very bad relation, as with any. Well, I don't know what's the situation between San Sebastian and Ourense, but of course, if you have a festival that are close by, they're fighting for the same films, and they're fighting, basically. So it's not really good, because Montreal is an older festival, and it used to be extremely good in the 70s. While Toronto was just like a very tiny festival at that time. But Toronto decided to invite Hollywood stars, and they would have what they call the powder room, which was of course cocaine-free for everyone. And it's true, this is documented, I'm not inventing this, it's in the biography of the festival. And where they would, they would bring all the people, and there was good partying, there was very good partying, and of course good partying is part of a good festival. Everyone knows it. So they had a few stars coming in, and when they were going back to Hollywood, they would say, "Wow, the Toronto is rocking. It's a good place to be." Oh yeah, really? I was invited last year. I didn't go. Well, maybe next year I'll go. So they started to attract the people this way, and of course it's not like that anymore. But that's the way they started to change the attitude, and during the 80s and beginning of the 90s, it started to attract more and more U.S. Hollywood stars, and the Hollywood industry discovered that Toronto was a very good ground in order to launch, to premiere new movies, because they had the Europeans coming to see the Hollywood stars that were there, so they could premiere the movie in front of European audiences and have the feeling, their perspective towards those movies. And as well, they would premiere the films outside of the US, and it could give them, so they would be away from the little clique or the little crowd that is used to be seeing films again every week, as they do in LA all the time. So it was a good ground in order for them to be halfway between Europe and the States. Unfortunately, it didn't happen in Montreal, because I think it would have been a perfect ground for this. But actually, I think we lost the cocaine battle.
Any questions? No questions. Sure. You can ask in Spanish, Galician, French, Hungarian, whatever you want.
Icelandic. I'm fluent in Icelandic.
So
it's okay.
This one is.
À la fin, je parle français avec toi.
Merci.
Est-ce que tu penses vraiment que la question de langue, c'est l'obstacle par la coproduction? Je pense qu'il y a des autres choses importantes. Pas seulement la langue.
I think, sorry. in the US, both of us. I think that the co-production in that environment has kind of a denaturalizing process.
Oui, je suis d'accord avec toi. C'est très difficile de faire des coproductions sans perdre son âme. Le problème, c'est ça. Regardez un pays comme la Belgique aujourd'hui. La Belgique coproduit tous les films français qui sont produits ou presque. Et il y a beaucoup d'acteurs qui sont des stars en France, comme Cécile de France, Jérémy Régnier, qui sont des gens d'origine belge, qui sont des Belges, mais que personne ne sait que c'est des Belges. On fait des films qui sont belges, mais jamais le mot Belgique n'est prononcé, jamais le mot Bruxelles n'est prononcé, et on fait des films qui sont des purs produits commerciaux. Et moi, j'ai de la difficulté avec ça. J'ai beaucoup de difficultés parce que je crois que le cinéma, c'est un art. Et c'est une forme d'expression qui doit aider à définir un certain espace culturel. Et un espace culturel, je m'excuse, mais on marche les deux pieds sur terre. On n'est pas dans les airs, on n'est pas en train de flotter comme les anges. Et donc, je crois qu'il faut absolument qu'on trouve une manière de faire des coproductions. Et je crois que cette manière-là n'est pas encore trouvée. On va devoir trouver une manière de faire des coproductions qui va permettre à tout le monde de se satisfaire. Et ça, c'est très important. J'ai vu un film il y a quelques années, un film islandais, et c'est pas une blague. J'ai vu un film islandais qui était une coproduction Islande-Japon. Aucune langue commune, aucun espace culturel commun. Donc, mon Dieu, comment est-ce qu'ils ont fait pour organiser le tout? Et c'est l'histoire d'un Japonais qui achète du thon. Il achète le thon, le gros poisson, qui est pêché là-bas. Et lui, son job, c'est vraiment d'aller goûter le thon pour être certain qu'il va décider c'est quoi la qualité du thon pour qu'on puisse l'envoyer sur le marché des restaurants chics de Tokyo ou encore vers les marchés de Hong Kong, etc. Et donc, lui, il est là et il fait une crise cardiaque alors qu'il est en train d'inspecter le thon. Et donc, selon tout un rituel japonais, il y a son fils qui doit venir sur place pour répandre une partie des cendres, etc. Et il y a toute une interaction entre les Japonais et les Islandais autour de ce thème-là. Vous voyez, ça, c'est une bonne idée. C'est une bonne idée qui fait qu'on est à cheval entre deux cultures. Et le film était à moitié en japonais, moitié en islandais, avec les sous-titres, et ça fonctionnait très, très bien. Mais personne y a perdu au change. Mais malheureusement, la plupart du temps, lorsqu'on fait une coproduction, il y a quelqu'un qui s'efface. Et on fait une coproduction à 3 ou 4 pays et il y a un seul pays qui gagne au bout de la ligne. Et les coproducteurs disent toujours la même chose. Ils disent, oui, ben écoute, après ça, on va faire une autre coproduction et on va renvoyer l'ascenseur et là, c'est toi qui vas avoir tout le terrain pour t'exprimer. Mais ça n'arrive jamais à ces trucs-là. Ça n'arrive jamais. La plupart du temps, les coproductions qui suivent sont plus compliquées à monter. Il y a un partenaire qui se retire. Vous voyez le genre. Le cinéma est tellement volatile au niveau de ses structures de production que les choses changent tellement rapidement que c'est très rare que les retours d'ascenseur se font correctement. Mais moi, je peux croire que si la coproduction se fait sur des bonnes bases, avec des producteurs intelligents et qui sont respectueux de la culture des autres, c'est possible d'y arriver. Mais comme on sait tous, le cinéma, c'est avant tout une industrie qui est faite pour faire du fric. Et souvent, le fric, il est beaucoup plus important que les intérêts culturels, malheureusement.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Denis. I think we have a break right now. We have a cup of coffee, discuss these things.
Solo por anotar lo que usted acaba de decir, bueno, Galego,
é como aquí decimos unha cousa similar que bueno, o máis importante nunha coproducción é a organicidade do relato e que os nosos produtores o que están facendo moitas veces o que fan son negocios coas películas e non películas que podan ser un negocio. Unha cousa das que decimos.
Producers here, when they talk about co-production, they try to make business with movies and not movies that can become business. And they lack organization in the project, something like the Postman, the wandering Postman effect, you know, to fix everything just to justify the co-production.
Well, you know, it's a different situation all the time, and I'm sure that with the Galician language and the relationship that you have with the central capital in Madrid is a different situation. I'm not sure I understood completely your question, but I do think that if the producers and the people who are working on co-production are film-oriented more than business-oriented, it's bound to make to have good results. But the thing is, you know, sometimes producers don't know much about film. They're very good at film structures, at financial structures, but they're not so good. You know, you would be amazed at the amount of scripts, film scripts that are being sent into my mailbox that are being sent by producers, and those scripts are pure rubbish. And you know, they think they can produce that. So that means that they don't know how to read a script. So you know, how could I trust them after that in order to do a co-production?
I think sometimes you have to. It's an engineering process.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're right.
So let's have that break.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Gracias.